you visited the Crimea platform, participate in this event. What do you think about this platform and about your participation during the last week in this event?
So, Vitaliy, I think the Crimea platform in general is a very good idea. It has been instrumental in keeping the whole question about Crimea and who it belongs to, that is Ukraine, and where its future is, that is with Ukraine, on people's agenda, on the international agenda, on the agenda of all people who kind of care about this part of the world. So I think the Crimea platform is a good idea. It's well organized. The discussions in Zagreb were, again, very informative, had a wide range of views. So I was very pleased to participate.
Okay, and you had the statement there that reparations of Russia should account at about $1 trillion. Are you still think about this amount of money, or maybe it should be more taking into account the ongoing attack on civil infrastructure?
Right. So we've all seen the estimates, both from the government of Ukraine and the international bodies, about the damage and the horror done by the bombings and the attacks and the invasion by Russia, not just on the infrastructure, but on people, on the number of Ukrainians killed by the Russians, the number of homes destroyed, the number of infrastructure pieces, that is, the kinds of equipment that's necessary to provide electricity and water to people's homes. All of that, together with the roads and the bridges that have been destroyed by the Russians. The estimates range from $500 billion to $1 trillion on how much it will cost to repair, to reconstruct, to renew all of this destruction. So then the question is, where does this money come from? And I'd suggested that the Russians ought to pay a lot of this. And a good place to start is with the reserves that the Russian central bank has in banks in the G7 nations. The Russian central bank had reserves of about $600 billion total. Half of that $600 billion is in banks that are in G7 nations, in the United States, in Europe, in Japan. And that money is frozen. That money is not available to the Russians. That money is available to the international community, and it's frozen now, and it could be taken and put into a fund that would begin the work on reconstruction. It might even begin the work to keep the Ukrainian government going day to day right now. Of course, we know that the government of Ukraine needs anywhere from $3 billion to $5 billion a month to be able to pay soldiers and to be able to pay healthcare workers and police, government workers. And so this is very important, that the Ukrainian government maintain the ability to function. And so some of that money that's frozen now, so that Russian central bank reserves, is frozen in the banks of the G7 nations, could be available for that function as well. So both for immediate needs to keep the government going and for this long-term reconstruction effort that might be $750 trillion. And as you say, maybe growing because of the continued destruction by the Russians against energy facilities. That money should be made available.
Okay, one question is not connected with interview. Are you okay with the military uniform behind you? It's normal or not? It's easier or
this? So a friend of mine is in the Ukrainian military, and he visited me, and he brought me a gift. And the gift was this jacket from the Ukrainian military. And so it is Ukrainian military jacket that is here. He gave it to me on my birthday. It was Vitaliy.
Okay. Sorry.
No, good question. Good question. I'm glad you noticed.
Yes, and maybe you follow the press conference of Putin last, and he said that he ready to negotiation with the United States, with Ukraine. What do you think? He's really ready to negotiation, or his precondition are not realistic and not achievable?
Vitaliy, I think President Putin is desperate. I think he realizes that he made a major blunder when he invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February of this year. And he needs to find a way out. So one way he's doing it is by trying to call up more reserves and put more soldiers in. Another way he's doing it is making these threats about nuclear use. And another way he's doing it is saying, as you just indicated, that he's ready to negotiate. But he has said before that he's only willing to negotiate if he keeps what he has right now, which is unacceptable to the Ukrainians. It's also unacceptable to the United States. It's unacceptable to NATO. We are not prepared to allow President Putin or Russia to keep the territory that they now illegally occupy without being pushed out. The Ukrainian military is pushing the Russians out of its country, out of Ukraine. And of course, President Putin would like to keep those territories, and he sees that the Ukrainian military is pushing him out. So he would like to stop that process. He would like to have a ceasefire that allows him to keep what he now has. That's unacceptable. So at some point, the Ukrainian government may decide to negotiate, but now's not the time. Not when they are succeeding, when the Ukrainian military is succeeding in pushing the Russians out of their country. That's what's going on right now. That's how this war will end, with the Russians leaving Ukraine.
What do you think? The usage of nuclear weapon is a real threat, or it's just bluff or something else?
Vitaliy, I think we have to take it seriously, of course. When a dictator who doesn't have any real control, any checks on what his decisions might be, when he threatens the use of nuclear weapons, we have to take it seriously. And we take it seriously. I know the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government take it seriously. When we take it seriously, that means we're watching very carefully. Our intelligence services are watching very carefully to see if there's any indication, any movement on the part of the Russian military to operationalize, to begin to move any of their nuclear weapons into a place where they could be used. They have to come out of storage, these nuclear weapons have to come out of storage and then moved to a place where they can be put on aircraft or put on missiles. And we can usually see that movement. And so we're very alert to any such movement. And we've been watching, and so far, we've not seen any of that movement. So far, there's no move by the Russians to take those weapons out of storage and put them onto delivery systems. So I think the chances are very low that he would actually do this. You just mentioned his speech. President Putin said again that he's a dangerous person. He indicated that he's very dangerous, but he said he has no intention of using nuclear weapons. You can't believe him, because he also said he had no intention of invading Ukraine, and he clearly did invade Ukraine. So we have to watch very carefully. The other thing we have to do, Vitaliy, is to make it clear to the Russians that we take it seriously, and that if they were to use a nuclear weapon, they would incur consequences, catastrophic consequences. We've not been explicit. We've not been very clear about what exactly that means. But what that does mean is there would be devastating consequences for the Russians if they were to use nuclear weapons. And that probably means there's been a lot of thought given to what kind of response the United States and NATO would give to some kind of a use. And probably it would not be, the response would not be nuclear weapons from our side, but probably it would be conventional attack on the units, the Russian units that were responsible for any nuclear use. So what we do know is what our national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, has said in public, and I'm sure he has said even more clearly in private to Russians, is that there will be catastrophic consequences if they use nuclear weapons.
What do you think about the role of China in this situation? Maybe China should share responsibility for this invasion because of its silence, and this silence encourage Putin to do what he wants to do in Ukraine. What do you think about the perspective of China participation in peace process or in some negotiation?
So I think you're right. The Chinese are in a very difficult position. Before the invasion, just before the invasion, when President Putin went to Beijing and had a meeting with President Xi, and they had a long meeting and issued a long statement at the end of the meeting. And President Xi said that that alliance, or at least that partnership, not really an alliance, but the partnership and cooperation had no limits, he said. And now he is in a bind. He is uncomfortable. President Xi is uncomfortable with this invasion and these horrible attacks of Russians on Ukrainians and the violation of Ukrainian sovereignty. The Chinese say that they respect the sovereignty of nations, including Ukraine. And they say they respect the territorial integrity of nations, including Ukraine. And of course, the Russians have totally violated Ukrainian sovereignty and totally violated territorial integrity. And so the Chinese are very uncomfortable with that. President Putin has asked President Xi for help, for assistance, in particular in two areas. One is in financial help, which President Xi has not been willing to help evade sanctions. So we have, as you know, these heavy sanctions on the Russians, and President Putin has asked President Xi to help him get around those sanctions, evade those sanctions. And President Xi has said no. He doesn't want to be sanctioned himself. He doesn't want the American sanctions and the European sanctions to apply to China if he were to try to help Putin evade those sanctions. So that's the first thing. But the other thing that President Putin has asked President Xi for are weapons. And so far, we've not seen any weapons going from China to Russia. So President Xi is in a difficult position. He made some commitments about unlimited cooperation back in January. Maybe he didn't even know, maybe he did know about the plans to invade, but he made some commitments about cooperation. And now he's very uncomfortable and has not been willing to provide the kind of assistance that President Putin has asked for.
Let's talk about future of Russia. What do you think about the perspective of this state, and maybe United States and Ukraine should prepare some plan what should be done in case of collapse of Putin regime and some changes inside Russia? Should we have some plan, and which role could play Ukraine in future reforms in Russia?
So President Putin is under pressure, there's no doubt. He's under political pressure from right-wing nationalists. When he tried to mobilize the army We tried to get 300,000 more troops. The Russian people, in particular, the Russian young men, fled. So he's got problems on his right. He's got problems on his left. We just talked about the problems he's got with China. That also includes India, who doesn't want to see him talk about nuclear weapons. So he's got difficulties there. He's losing on the battlefield. His military is not doing well, and his military is starting to criticize itself and these quasi-military. So Prigozhin and Kadyrov are pointing fingers at Shoigu, the defense minister. So there's all of this problems that President Putin has, which is weakening him. And then, as you say, Vitaliy, this could lead to a destabilization of President Putin's regime. And then your question is, should we be planning for this? We should be thinking about this. These are decisions and actions that have to come from the Russian people, whether it's the Russian people across the country or whether it's people in the Kremlin that make some decisions about whether or not President Putin is the right one to lead them. Those are Russian decisions. But you're right. That's something that we should be thinking about, planning for. We've seen problems in the Russian Federation in Soviet times. As we saw in 1991, the Soviet Union disintegrated into 15 independent countries. It's certainly possible that the Russian Federation could have some similar kinds of problems. So we should be thinking about that. We should be thinking about what that would mean for Ukraine, for NATO, for the United States. So we should be thinking about this, but this is a decision. These are actions that have to be taken by Russians, and that at least as far as the United States is concerned, we're not particularly good at intervening in other countries' internal processes. We've tried in the past, and we haven't done so well in the past. So we're not so good at intervening in other people's politics. But we should be ready if there are some changes in Moscow that would put Russia on a better path.
Mm-hmm. What should be done in Moscow, maybe by a new government, to normalize the relationship with Western countries and with Ukraine?
The first thing that they should do is pull all the Russian troops out of Ukraine. Pull all the Russian troops out of Ukraine, out of Donbass, out of Crimea, and if there is a new Russian regime that wants to live peacefully in Europe, or with Europe, or with Ukraine, they have to make a commitment to respect the sovereignty of all nations, respect the sovereignty of Ukraine, respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So pulling all their soldiers out, pulling all of the occupying Russian military out of Ukraine is the first thing, and then make commitments to sovereignty of other nations. Those are the kind of things that a new government in Moscow would have to do in order to rejoin the community of nations.
Mm-hmm. In Ukraine, I see that in Ukraine officials have a little bit different view on situation in Russia than people in Washington or Brussels. In terms of in Ukraine, officials think that Russian people, they are responsible for the regime of Putin because they agree with this regime from point of view in Kiev. In the western part of Europe and the world, I have heard more thoughts that this is Putin's regime responsible for invasion, not Russian people. From your point of view, how this responsibility could be shared between government and ordinary people?
You're right, Vitaliy. There is a debate on this question. My view is informed by people who I respect who know Russian history well. I'm not a Russian history scholar, but I know people who have studied Russian history. I know Ukrainians. I know Lithuanians. I know Poles who have studied Russian history and have lived part of Russian history. And I'm impressed with the understanding of these experts, these scholars, of the continuity, of the tendency, at least the tendency of Russian people over centuries, not just since Putin was in office, but the Russian history of aggression, of expansion, of oppression, of oppressing minority groups. Ukrainians know about oppression from the Russians and the Soviets, the czars. Ukrainians know this history. The Baltic people know this history. The Poles know this history. East Europeans know this history, that Russia tends to be led by autocrats, and Russia tends to expand. Russia tends to be aggressive in this expansion. Russia tends to suppress minorities wherever they are, around there or in their areas. So this is not just Putin. This is a Russian tendency over centuries. So I think it's right to recognize that tendency and to defend oneself. The Ukrainians, the Europeans, NATO. That's the reason for NATO. NATO was formed, as we know, not to counter Putin, but to defend against the Soviets and then the Russians. So it's not just Putin. It is Russia that we have to oppose, that we have to defend against, that we have to contain until another government comes in and tries to bring Russia back into the community of nations, like we just said.
Mm-hmm. And the last question: United States very soon will have an election, and what do you think about the results of this election and the possible consequences on policy toward Ukraine?
Vitaliy, I think there will be no big changes on U.S. policy toward Ukraine coming out of this election. Why do I say that? Right now, under this Congress and under previous Congresses, this has been true for decades, that the support for Ukraine has been bipartisan, Republicans and Democrats. It's been House and Senate. It's been U.S. administration after U.S. administration. It's been under President Clinton, under President Bush, under President Obama, under another President Bush, certainly under President Biden. This support for Ukraine has been bipartisan and consistent, and it continues today. And so far, these votes in the elections, in the votes in the Congress that have been there to authorize big Ukraine packages, assistance packages, military assistance packages for Ukraine, have been overwhelmingly supported. That will continue for two reasons. One is, even though we hear some arguments and some questions from the extreme right or the extreme left in the United States, the middle, the solid majority of Republicans and Democrats continue to support Ukraine and will continue to support Ukraine after the election. Usually in U.S. elections, there are not many changes. There's some changes here and there, but not enough to make a big change in a major policy like this. No, I firmly believe that the new Congress will continue to support Ukraine, will continue to provide military assistance as long as it takes. President Biden has been very clear, as long as it takes. And Republican leaders have been very clear too. Senator McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, has been very clear. He's been there. He's been to Kyiv. he is supporting Ukraine as strongly as anyone. So it's bipartisan, and that I think, that I am sure, Vitaliy, will continue.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.